My name is Sigrid Schmalzer. I'm a professor here in the History Department, and it is my tremendous privilege to welcome you all to the keynote lecture of the UMass History Department's Fall 2012 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. This evening, we're very proud to present Professor James Anaya, UN Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples. And I promise I won't take too much of your time before we get to his lecture, but I do want to begin with a few words of thanks to some of the many people who helped make this event possible. And first, in keeping with the precedent set in our Symposium on Indigenous Peoples, Truth and Reconciliation, which happened on Tuesday of this week, I'd like to begin by thanking the Nahlwatog people originally of this area and the other Algonquin peoples of Massachusetts for permitting us to be on their land today so we can have this special event. Professor Jane Anderson in the Anthropology Department will be coming up shortly to introduce our speaker, and I want to recognize the work that she and Professor Alice Nash of the History Department invested in the extraordinary symposium we held on Tuesday. They were also of great help in organizing Professor Anaya's visit to UMass today. I'd also like to recognize History Department Chair Joy Bowman, staff members Jean Ball, Suzanne Bell, and Mary Lashway, and the members of the Feinberg Series Committee, Brian Bunk, Dan Char, Jill Dwiggins, and Marla Miller. Brian Bunk took the lead on recruiting Professor Anaya, so we're very grateful to him. And Jill Dwiggins is responsible for the beautiful posters and flyers that I hope you have had the chance to see around campus. And speaking of the posters and flyers, I'd also like to express our gratitude to Mr. Cecil Paul of the Haisla Nation for his generosity in allowing us to use this image of the totem called Dila Hila Yu as the unifying image in the publicity for our series. The title associated with the totem means steering his people in the right direction, which we found to be truly appropriate for this series as a whole. Finally, I'd like to extend our deepest appreciation to History Department alum Kenneth Feinberg. The series is named after him and his family. His generosity makes it possible for us to hold these series every 2 years, not always on Truth and Reconciliation. The first one was on the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board, and we've had other topics since then. So for those of you who don't already know, Kenneth Feinberg is a nationally recognized lawyer who served as director of the Congressional Fund to assist the families of those killed or injured in the attacks of September 11th, 2001. His book, titled What is Life Worth?, grew out of that experience, and more recently he has also overseen compensation for victims of the BP oil spill. And I have to say, when I first came to the UMass History Department, I kind of assumed that everyone spoke so glowingly of him because he was so generous in his funding of our department, and certainly that's part of it. But I had the opportunity to hear him speak last year, and I was very impressed and realized that our appreciation for him goes far beyond that. It's also not just that the words, "and I owe it all to the History Department," seem to come so readily to his lips, which we also deeply appreciate. But also, he is just the kind of alum that any history professor would be truly proud to call their student. His words and his deeds, he demonstrates a profound historical sensibility. He understands that he inhabits a specific moment in time that is contingent on events in the past. And this appreciation for the significance of history clearly informs the very thoughtful approach he takes in seeking justice in the present day. So we think that the theme of this series, Truth and Reconciliation, History and Justice, reflects Kenneth Feinberg's interests very well, as does the theme of this keynote address. For Feinberg is always asking, what is our collective responsibility to victims, and what would it take to make things right? So I hope very much that you will be able to join us for future events in the series. The next one coming up is next Wednesday, October 10th at 4 p.m. right here as well. It's Truth and Reconciliation in Comparative Perspective, a panel with speakers on South Africa, Latin America, and the north of Ireland. So I would like now to invite up to the podium Professor Jane Anderson, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of this land upon which we are gathered, the Noatag peoples. It is custom in my country to acknowledge the land upon where we stand and where we speak, and to pay our respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians. James Anaya is a Regents Professor and James Lenoir Professor of Human Rights Law and Policy at the University of Arizona Rogers College of Law. In 2008, he was appointed by the United Nations as a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Professor Anaya is a graduate of the University of New Mexico and Harvard Law School. He was on the law faculty at the University of Iowa from 1988 to 1999, and he's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, the University of Toronto, and the University of Tulsa. Prior to becoming a full-time law professor, he practiced law in Albuquerque, New Mexico, representing Native American peoples and other minority groups. Professor Anaya teaches and writes in the areas of international human rights law, constitutional law, and issues concerning Indigenous peoples. Among his numerous publications is his acclaimed book, Indigenous Peoples and International Law, this one, and it's available for sale up the back. I use this and teach this a lot in my classes. Professor Anaya has lectured in many countries in all continents. He has been a consultant for numerous organizations and government agencies in several countries on matters of human rights and Indigenous peoples. And he's represented Indigenous groups from many parts of North and Central America in landmark cases before courts and international organizations. He was the lead counsel for the Indigenous parties in the case of Awas-Tiningi versus Nicaragua, in which the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for the first time upheld Indigenous land rights as a matter of international law. More recently, he led the legal team that successfully achieved a judgment by the Supreme Court of Belize, affirming the traditional land rights of the Maya people of that country. As the UN Special Rapporteur, Professor Anaya's mandate is to examine ways and means of overcoming existing obstacles to the full and effective protection of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Indigenous people, in conformity with his mandate to identify, exchange, and promote best practice. Additionally, the Special Rapporteur is to gather, request, receive, and exchange information and communication from all relevant sources, including governments, Indigenous peoples and their communities and organizations, on all alleged violations of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to formulate recommendations and proposals on appropriate measures and activities to prevent and remedy violations. In this capacity, Professor Anaya has researched, prepared, and presented numerous country reports, special reports, and statements. In 2012, 2 new reports have been completed, including the first on the situation of Indigenous peoples in the United States. This marks the first time that the United States has allowed an external body to formally investigate and comment upon the situation of Indigenous communities in this country. The report was presented to the UN General Assembly in August and the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva last week. Speaking before the Council, James Anaya stated that Indigenous communities in the United States continue to face significant challenges that are related to widespread historical wrongs, including broken treaties and acts of oppression, and misguided government policies that today manifest themselves in various indicators of disadvantage and impediments to the exercise of their individual and collective rights. Given the recent release of this new report, we are extremely honored to have Professor Anaya give the keynote lecture for the Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series on Truth and Reconciliation, History and Justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Anaya.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to give a keynote address as part of the Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. I want to thank the faculty members, the students, the staff who've helped to bring me here and welcomed me here and made me feel somewhat at home, or I should say at home, really. As was mentioned in the introduction, I hold the position of United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And also as mentioned, as part of my work as United Nations Special Rapporteur, I conduct visits to countries to examine the conditions of indigenous peoples in those various countries, and I've traveled now to a number of countries, upwards of 20. And earlier this year, I focused on the human rights situation of Native Americans, including American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. And in doing so, I conducted an official mission to the United States over a period of about 12 days. Thank you. This evening, I want to address the subject of reconciliation with indigenous peoples by sharing with you parts of what I found and reported as a result of this inquiry into the United States. During the mission, I spent a few days in Washington meeting with government officials, and then I traveled to various places across the country over a period of several days to meet with indigenous communities and their leaders. When I returned to my home in Tucson after that tour, waiting for me was a manila envelope stuffed with letters written by students from an English class at White River High School, which is just outside the reservation of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. In a cover letter, the class's teacher explained, the students would like to feel that they have a voice, as it is so desolate here that it is sometimes hard to remember there's an outside world. He continued, despite all the hardships here, these kids are so incredibly resilient and talented. The teacher's words quickly took on poignant meaning for me as I read the first letter in the stack, which was from a 15-year-old girl who lamented, life here is very hand-to-mouth. Out here, we don't have the finer things. You get what you get, and you don't throw a fit. And I'm going to be honest with you. Sometimes I don't eat. I've never told anyone this before, not even my mom. But I don't eat sometimes because I feel bad about making my mom buy food that I know is expensive. And you know what? Life is hard enough for my mom, so I will probably never tell her. My parents have enough to worry about. I do not know what you can do, but try your very best to help us. Please help us. We can do this. Yes, we can! Exclamation point. The hardship combined with resilience evident in these words was reflected in the other letters, giving me a highly personalized gloss on the U.S. Census data that show indigenous Americans to be in a highly disadvantaged condition relative to others. Overall, as many of you know, Native Americans suffer from poverty, poor health, low attainment in formal education, and a range of related social ills at rates that far exceed those of any other ethnic group in the country. One of the grimmest statistics is that Native American women are twice as likely to be raped as non-Native women, and 80% of those rapes are at the hands of non-Native men. The conditions of extreme disadvantage that are experienced by the vast majority of Native Americans, which number around 5 million, are not mere happenstance. They stem from the loss of vast territories with abundant resources, the active suppression of indigenous cultures, the undermining of indigenous people's own institutions of self-governance, entrenched patterns of racial discrimination, and outright brutality. Many Indian nations conveyed land to the United States or its colonial predecessors by treaty, but almost invariably under coercion following warfare or threat of warfare. And in exchange, usually for little more than promises of government assistance and protection that usually proved illusory or worse. In other cases, lands were simply taken by force or fraud. In many instances, treaty provisions that guaranteed reserved rights to tribes over lands or resources were broken by the United States or under pressure to acquire land for non-indigenous interests. I believe it's a testament to the goodwill of Indian nations that they have uniformly insisted on observance of the treaties even regarding them as sacred compacts rather than challenge their terms as inequitable. Nearly in all cases, the loss of land meant the substantial or complete undermining of Indigenous peoples' own economic foundations and means of subsistence, as well as cultural loss, given the centrality of land to cultural and related social patterns. Especially devastating instances of such loss involve the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, as happened, for example, with the Choctaw, Cherokee, and other Indigenous people who were removed from their homes in the southeastern United States to the Oklahoma Territory in a trek through what has been called a trail of tears, in which many of them perished. In addition to millions of acres of lands lost, often in violations of treaties, a history of inadequately controlled extractive and other activities within or near remaining Indigenous lands, including nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining in the western United States, has resulted in widespread environmental harm and has caused serious and continued health problems against Native Americans. In many places, including in Alaska and in the Pacific Northwest in particular, Indigenous peoples continue to depend on hunting and fishing. And the maintenance of these subsistence activities is essential for both their physical and cultural survival, especially in isolated areas. However, Indigenous peoples face ever greater threats to their subsistence activities due to a growing surge of competing activities and restrictive state and federal regulatory regimes. With their loss of land, Indigenous peoples have lost control over places of cultural and religious significance. Particular sites and geographic spaces that are sacred to Indigenous peoples can be found throughout the vast expanse of lands that have passed to government hands. The ability of Indigenous peoples to use and access their sacred places are often curtailed by mining, logging, hydroelectric, and other development projects, which are carried out by permits handed out by federal or state authorities. In many cases, the very presence of these kinds of activities is a desecration. Historically, added to the taking of Indigenous lands was the direct assault on Indigenous cultural expression that was carried out or facilitated by the federal or state governments. Likely the program of this type with the most devastating consequences was the systemic removal of Indigenous children from their families to place them in government or church-run boarding schools, with the objective of expunging them of their Indigenous identities. Captain Richard Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian School, coined the phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," in instituting the boarding school policy in the 1880s, which continued well into the 1900s. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse within the boarding schools has been well documented. Typically, upon entering a boarding school, Indigenous children had their hair cut, were forced to wear uniforms, and were prohibited from practicing their cultural traditions. The compounding effect of the generations of Indigenous people, including generations still living, having passed through these schools, cuts deep in Indigenous communities throughout the United States, where social problems are now pervasive and loss of language is widespread. Additionally, a pattern of placing Indigenous children in non-Indigenous care under state custody proceedings with similar effects on Indigenous individuals and communities continued well into the 1970s, only to be blunted by the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. This federal legislation advances a strong presumption of Indigenous custody for Indigenous children, but it continues to face barriers in its implementation. Many Indigenous representatives in all the locations I visited during my U.S. mission stressed the importance to the health and well-being of their peoples of securing and recovering the various expressions and practices of their cultures, including Indigenous languages, and of being able to transmit their cultures and identities to future generations, along with securing ties to land and natural resources and enhancing self-government capacity. I think it can readily be seen that historical wrongdoings against Native Americans mark the history of the settlement of the country and the building of its economy. Yet Americans, that is, other than Native Americans whose ancestors were first on the continent, tend to glorify the building of the world's richest and most powerful country from what is usually portrayed as a previously untamed and uncivilized land, despite the costs to the prior inhabitants. That glorification, embellished with accounts of manifest destiny, is historically facilitated by regarding the first peoples as being of an inferior race, indeed as savages. And this characterization is found not only in popular discourse, but also in the legal opinions of the nation's highest court that served to justify the subjugation of Native Americans and the taking of their lands. Every American schoolboy knows, wrote Justice Reed for the U.S. Supreme Court in 1955, that the savage tribes of this continent were deprived of their ancestral ranges by force. It was not a sale, but the conqueror's will that deprived them of their land. Now, while such racially discriminatory attitudes have faded, although not entirely disappeared, the conditions of Native Americans and their legitimate aspirations of self-sufficiency and self-determination have become relatively invisible in the broader public sphere, an invisibility that perpetuates Native people's sense of loss and alienation. This invisibility is fueled by persistent stereotypes that tend to render Native Americans relics of the past. These stereotypes are perpetuated by the use of Indian names by professional and other high-profile sports teams, caricatures in the popular media, and even in mainstream education on history and social studies. As I traveled to various parts of the country, I heard complaints from leaders of indigenous nations and peoples about how these stereotypes obscure understanding of the reality of Native Americans today, and instead help to keep alive attitudes of racial discrimination. But at the same time, indigenous leaders told me of their efforts to rebuild strong, healthy, and economically vibrant communities within the reservations or other spaces that have been left to them, and to recover, preserve, and transmit to future generations their distinctive cultural manifestations, including languages and religious practices. And reflecting the resilience of the Native high school students who wrote to me, it is apparent that many of the hundreds of indigenous nations and tribes that have survived in America are now succeeding in this effort, as many find creative ways to exercise greater capacities of self-governance and decision-making over health, education, and sustainable economic development in their communities. Still, Native leaders pointed out to me the multiple barriers they face from dominant political actors at the state and federal levels. By and large, for mainstream officials, the tribe's problems and pleas for cooperation in addressing them are not a matter of priority or are not on the political radar. The invisibility of Native Americans in mainstream society and politics is a function of their relatively small numbers in the United States, coupled with the impulse of many among the dominant majority to simply avoid thinking about the reality and aspirations of Native Americans, especially when to do so would be to recall a discomforting history. The well-known television commentator Bill O'Reilly succumbed to this impulse in questioning the usefulness of my mission to the United States during a segment of his Fox News show in which he bantered with the comedian and pundit Dennis Miller. Native Americans should just get over it, declared O'Reilly, to which Miller responded approvingly while saying with attempted sarcasm that Native Americans should instead be called the casino owner Americans. And then he proceeded to bash the United Nations. That such sentiments are reflexively expressed in what most, or at least many, would consider part of the mainstream media is telling. The appearance of casinos on Indian reservations in the last several decades has conveniently provided many with blinders to popularize the invisibility of Native Americans, their disadvantaged conditions, and the historical roots of those conditions. In reality, fewer than a third of the approximately 566 federally recognized or acknowledged tribes in the United States have casinos. And of those, at most a dozen provide significant windfalls to the tribes, such that they are able to distribute substantial per capita payments to tribal members, according to University of Tulsa law professor William Rice, who is an Indian gaming expert. Far from rendering Native Americans a class of economic barons, the Indian casinos represent an adaptive economic strategy of self-help in the midst of ongoing challenges. It should not go without saying that key federal laws and programs, beginning with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1973, and important federal court decisions affirming the inherent sovereignty of tribes over their lands and members, have contributed to effective self-governance and improved conditions for Native Americans in many places. Additionally, in the last several years, the federal executive branch has enacted a number of needed reforms in government programming, increased funding for the benefit of tribes and their members in certain areas, and advanced the settlement of claims for government misuse of tribal assets, although not without some ongoing controversy. Yet, by all accounts, the dozens of Indigenous leaders I met in places across the country, and by my own assessment of the situation, there is still yet to be an adequate reckoning for what has been taken from or inflicted upon Native Americans. By and large, the first Americans remain alienated and disadvantaged as they strive to maintain the integrity of their distinct cultures along with their social and economic development. It is clear that numerous matters relating to the history of misdealing and harm inflicted on Indigenous peoples in this country are still unresolved. In all my consultations with Indigenous peoples during my mission to the United States, it was impressed upon me that historical wrongs continue to live in intergenerational memory and trauma, and that together with current systemic problems, they still inflict harm. Across the United States, I heard specific unresolved problems of historical origins and systemic dimensions. And Indigenous representatives made abundantly clear that these problems continue to breed disharmony, dislocation, and hardship. The sentiment that Native Americans should just get over it is largely premised on the view that wrongs against them are a matter of distant history with little or no effects on lives in the present. But if one turns an objective eye toward the reality of Indigenous peoples in the United States, as elsewhere, one can readily see that the accumulated wrongs continue to be very much felt today. I am convinced that unless genuine movement is made toward resolving these pending matters, the place of Indigenous peoples within the United States will continue to be an unstable, disadvantaged, and inequitable one, and the country's moral standing will suffer. In my report on my mission to the United States, I called for robust measures of reconciliation that build upon initiatives and processes already in place. In human relations, reconciliation means confronting and overcoming the roots and manifestations of inequity and disharmony. The United States Congress actually took a step in this direction in 2010 when it adopted a resolution of apology to Indigenous peoples of the country following in the spirit of an apology previously issued to Native Hawaiians in 1993. After citing a series of wrongdoings against Native Americans, the 2010 resolution states, and I quote, "The United States, acting through Congress, apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted upon Native peoples by citizens of the United States and expresses its regret." End of quote. The policy also, and again I quote, urges the President to acknowledge the wrongs of the United States against Indian tribes in the history of the United States in order to bring about healing in this land. End of quote. The full text of the apology bears reading. However, strangely, the apology was buried deep in a Defense Appropriations Act, and apparently few Indigenous people, much less the public in general, were made aware of it. Desmond Tutu said, "Forgiving and being reconciled are not about pretending that things are other than they are. It is not about putting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end it is worthwhile, because in the end only an honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing. Superficial reconciliation can bring only superficial healing. My hope is that the congressional resolution of apology to the country's First Peoples can lead to more than just superficial reconciliation. But in order to do so, it needs to be made more widely known, to be a point of public awakening, so that it can then mark a path for concrete measures to address issues whose resolution is essential to defeating disharmony in favor of genuine healing. It is indeed surprising how little is known of the congressional resolution of apology, how little has been said of it publicly by either members of Congress or the executive branch of government, and how absent it has been from the mainstream media. Similar statements of apology in other countries, in particular Canada and Australia, were ceremoniously proclaimed by the heads of government of those countries in the spotlight of the media, and were followed by specific action to promote reconciliation, however insufficient or incomplete that action may still be. But the apology and call for steps toward healing by the U.S. Congress have not much seen the light of day. The invisibility of Native Americans and their concerns persist. Reconciliation requires a national conversation, assisted rather than impeded by the media, a conversation that overcomes the invisibility of Native Americans and engenders a fresh understanding of their place and contributions to the building of the country. It requires that public officials at both the federal and state levels enhance lines of communication to build or strengthen understanding and cooperatively develop needed reforms in legislation and government programming. And it requires coming fairly to terms with the still unresolved claims to possession of or access to lands to which Indigenous peoples maintain cultural and spiritual ties, and that are potentially important to their economic development and health. Indigenous leaders across the country stress to me the fundamental importance to the survival and well-being of their peoples, of securing the protection and access to sacred places that are throughout their traditional or ancestral territories. In my report on my mission to the United States, I highlighted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, pointing to it as an important impetus and guide for measures to address the concerns of Native Americans and to move toward reconciliation. An authoritative instrument with broad support, the Declaration has as its central purpose the goal of remedying the injustices and inequitable conditions faced by Indigenous peoples across the globe. It calls for determined action to secure their rights within a model of respect for their self-determination and distinctive cultural identities. The Declaration represents a global consensus among governments and Indigenous peoples worldwide that is joined in by the United States as well as by Indigenous peoples in this country. It was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly with the affirmative votes of an overwhelming majority of UN member states, amid expressions of celebration by Indigenous peoples from around the world. At the urging of Indigenous leaders from throughout this country, President Barack Obama announced the United States' support for the Declaration on December 16, 2010. And he did so before a gathering at the White House of leaders of Indigenous nations and tribes. By its very nature, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not in itself legally binding, or is not itself as a document legally binding. But it is nonetheless an extension of the commitment assumed by UN member states, including the United States, to promote and respect human rights under the United Nations Charter, customary international law, and multilateral human rights treaties to which the United States is a party, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Whatever its precise legal significance, the Declaration embodies a convergence of common understanding about the rights of Indigenous peoples upon a foundation of fundamental human rights, including rights of equality, self-determination, property, and cultural integrity. It is a product of more than 2 decades of deliberations in which the experiences and aspirations of Indigenous peoples worldwide, along with the failures and successes of the relevant laws and policies of states over time, were closely examined with a view toward promoting human rights. The Declaration can now be seen as part of United States domestic and foreign policy. This is indicated by a paper circulated by the U.S. Department of State expounding upon President Obama's announcement of support for the Declaration. The paper explains that the United States endorsement of the Declaration, and I quote, reflects the U.S. commitment to work with indigenous tribes, individuals, and communities to address the many challenges they face. The United States aspires to improve relations with indigenous peoples by looking to the principles embodied in the Declaration and its dealings with federally recognized tribes, while also working as appropriate with all indigenous individuals and communities in the United States. Moreover, the United States is committed to serving as a model in the international community in promoting and protecting the collective rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the human rights of all individuals. End of quote. Now, as part of United States domestic and foreign policy, as an extension of its international human rights obligations, and reflecting a commitment to indigenous peoples in the United States in principle, the Declaration should now serve as a beacon for executive, legislative, and judicial decision-making in relation to issues concerning indigenous peoples of the country. All such decision-making should incorporate awareness and close consideration of the Declaration's terms. Moreover, the Declaration is an important instrument that should motivate and guide steps towards still needed reconciliation with the country's indigenous peoples on just terms. The Declaration envisions a future in which the countries of the world embrace and uplift indigenous peoples on fair and equitable terms, with effective recognition of their rights to exist as distinct peoples in harmony with the societies that have grown up around them, free from social and economic disparities rooted in histories of oppression. Realization of such a future in the United States could only serve to further the values of equality and democracy that the country embraces. As we ponder the possibilities of a genuine process of reconciliation, it is obvious that history cannot be undone. But the future can mark a new direction, a point stressed to me in the letters from the students at the White River High School in South Dakota. I have stated that a future reconciliation should include ways to restore to indigenous peoples some measure of control over lands to which they have a legitimate claim, especially lands taken from them in flagrant violation of treaties or U.S. law, and over which they maintain strong cultural ties. And I've given as an example the Black Hills of South Dakota, which were guaranteed to the Lakota and other tribes of the Great Sioux Nation by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, but which, as confirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court, were taken from the Sioux tribes illegally. The Lakota and other Sioux tribes have refused to accept compensation for the taking of the hills, given the cultural and religious significance of the land to them to this day. My statements about the Black Hills have been sensationalized by some in the media as a demand to give all the lands taken from Native Americans back to them, without regard for the context of reconciliation in which my statements were made. In fact, there are important precedents for the restoration of control over or access to land to indigenous peoples in the United States. These precedents include the return of the sacred Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo in 1971, and the restoration of land to the Timba-Shoshone tribe in 2000. Both land areas were restored from land under federal administration with no negative consequences for any individual property interests. Another exemplary action is the more recent initiative to transfer management of the national park lands to the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota. These kinds of measures reveal needed understanding of the centrality of land and geographic spaces to the physical and cultural well-being of indigenous peoples, in accordance with standards now prevailing internationally and accepted by the United States. In the characterization of my recommendation to further restore land to Native Americans as an absurd call to return the country's entire landmass back to indigenous ownership, we see again the impulse to keep invisible the true nature of the matter. Yet, if such invisibility can be overcome, I hope it will yield to a future in which, for example, the Black Hills would not just be seen as the home of the iconic Mount Rushmore, or symbolize the defeat of Native Americans who today live in the hill shadow in third world conditions. It should be possible to find ways in which the Black Hills, an area that at present is almost all designated federal public land, can once again be a part of the life of the indigenous peoples for whom it remains sacred, as well as a place revered by the American people more broadly. Imagine what that would mean to the Lakota kids at the White River High School. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah.
So Professor Anaya will now take questions. He'll field the questions himself, so please help him get the ball rolling.
Maybe say your name.
Hi, my name is Libby. I'm a student here. And I was wondering, you had mentioned the significantly higher rates of rape and sexual assault amongst Native women, particularly at the hands of non-Native peoples. And I was wondering, what do you think catalyzes that high rate?
It's hard to say. I mean, Native women are vulnerable in multiple ways, and there have been studies on this. The statistics I cite are from the U.S. Justice Department, so they're not really disputed. But it's the multiple vulnerabilities that Native women face, and a serious problem is the lack of prosecution of these crimes, because of the lack of prosecutorial authority of tribal courts over these kinds of crimes, given the jurisdictional limitations that have been imposed on them by acts of Congress and by precedents of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, there has been legislation introduced and passed by the Senate to remove these jurisdictional limitations, but it hasn't been able to pass the House. It's legislation promoted by the administration, and something that they have, I think, have genuinely actively tried to achieve. Yet it hasn't been adopted. So it's a real problem that persists and is exacerbated by the lack of effective prosecution of these crimes. Yes.
What about, releasing Leonard Peltier as a first step, like in South Africa, they've released Nelson Mandela, and then he could help negotiate a way forward?
A very wise statement. In my report on the situation in the United States, which I invite you to read, I point to a number of what I call both symbolic and substantive issues that burn in the country with regard to Native Americans. This is one of them. I cite a few others. And so one of the recommendations I make is that a renewed consideration be given to clemency for Leonard Peltier, because it would be, as you point out, I think, a step towards reconciliation. It's complex. There's still significant forces against that. It's politically sensitive for the president, which is something the president probably doesn't need right now, such politically sensitive issues. But I think it's something that needs to be pushed for, and as you rightly point out, would be both substantively an important move as well as symbolically an important move toward reconciliation. There was in the very back, there's a hand up. I think it's this invisibility that I keep referring to. It really is something, how in the mainstream culture or society, Native Americans really are invisible in mainstream politics. It's hard for those of us who live within or close to Indian country or are interested in Native issues and become interested. But within the mainstream, Native peoples really are quite invisible. In my dealings with the government, for example, in diplomatic arenas that I often find myself in as UN Special Rapporteur, where the central subject isn't indigenous peoples or or human rights more broadly. The level of ignorance and it's not intentional or malicious ignorance, but the ignorance nonetheless about the presence of Native Americans. So we have our diplomats going around the world representing the country with scant knowledge of this important component of the culture and the society. And that's representative of what I think we see overall. The educational materials that we see in the schools really does treat today indigenous peoples as something of the past for the most part. Even where I live in the Tucson School District, where we're surrounded by Native people, the Native people attend the schools. The textbooks really do reflect that invisibility. It's quite astounding. And that is a challenge I think indigenous peoples in this country face that indigenous peoples in Mexico don't face, and most countries in Latin America. They face other challenges, and some might argue graver challenges, but that invisibility makes it difficult to move the ball forward. So that if there is an apology achieved, an act of Congress, no one knows about it. No one cares. It's not communicated. I mean, how absurd, you know? And that is just telling of that invisibility, and that's what I would say is what is a core problem, and it also distinguishes indigenous peoples, the challenges faced by indigenous peoples here, as opposed to many other countries. And I would say also, as not just these Latin American countries I mentioned, also Canada. I think there's certainly problems there, but the issue is more visible. The mainstream press covers. You know, whenever I make a statement as Special Rapporteur having to do with Canada, the Globe and Mail, which is a major Canadian national newspaper, the CBC, you know, which is the major television station, will contact me. That doesn't happen here. You know, I just get these caricatures on Bill O'Reilly, you know, mispronouncing my name and talking about the weird UN and the casino owning Native Americans kind of thing. So it's really something. Yeah, here.
My name's Ben Savage. I also go here, and I noticed that you said the dominant majority simply avoid thinking about it. Tying in with what she said, do you think it's possible that any sort of true reconciliation will be accomplished without this acknowledgement of the majority of the referendum?
No, I don't. That's why I think there has to be this national conversation that I spoke of. There has to be a national dialogue a campaign, as it were, of education, similar to what we've seen in other contexts of other minority groups. An Indigenous Peoples Day, an Indigenous Peoples Month, and in a way that's conducive to harmony and pride of the country as a whole, where the country can know of its native roots, you know, and take some ownership of that. I know that may everybody not agree with that approach, but I think that is the approach that is consistent with the spirit of reconciliation and inclusion on just terms of Native peoples in the country. And we're far from that. This country is far from that with this invisibility. I'm happy to see that there's a big crowd here here tonight, and you know, these kinds of things, these kind of events in the universities and hopefully beyond. But there needs to be political leadership that moves forward with these issues. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Cindy Fowler. In your travels around the world, are there any examples of reconciliation in other countries that maybe we could learn from?
Well, there's been a seminar or conference over the last couple of days where there's been examination of certain other countries. You have the Canadian example. It's a process of reconciliation, and a commission actually formed, formal commission, around the issue of residential schools. So the same thing we experienced here with the boarding schools, similar thing. In Australia as well, I mentioned there's been a process of reconciliation. You know, there's a lot to be criticized about both those processes, as I said earlier, and many regard them as simply ways to sort of cover over the real deep-seated problems and have an apology, you know, commission, and then that's it. but I think the jury's still out, as it were, and you know that those are necessary steps and towards raising awareness. In other countries, there are different forms of reconciliation that has more to do with the country little by little becoming more aware of its indigenous roots. We see that in Latin America. We see determined action in that connection as a way of the country coming together. In many countries in Latin America, it hasn't been formally framed as a reconciliation move, but we've seen constitutional reform taking place, so that indigenous peoples have participated in constitutional reform efforts, so that they then become included within the constitutions, with their identity, with respect for their distinct identities and self-determination to some extent, and their collective rights recognized. There's a move towards that. So that is, you know, the kind of coming together of on a broad societal level that we see in a number of countries. Now, I'm not in any way saying that these steps are sufficient. We don't. I cannot point to a country and say, oh, they've solved the problem. They've fully recognized and implemented it. I cannot point to that. I'm simply referring to steps in that direction. Yeah, ma'am. Okay, sorry.
My name is Cheryl Hogan. My ancestors were some of the original colonizers, and for that I offer apologies. My question is there any national effort in this country on the grassroots level or any other level that mentions the word reconciliation that's working toward beginning to
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is whether there's any initiative in this country toward reconciliation. You know, in Maine, there's a special regime in place that's been promoted at the state level toward reconciliation around a series of issues and claims there. It's very interesting. I mean, there have been a lot of bumps in the road, but some interesting steps forward. And that's just right in the right in your backyard here, so or front yard. I don't know. I don't want to say the wrong thing here. But you know, and I think that someone told me that was discussed during the seminar here. There have been some interesting moves among the various churches that have made declarations of reconciliation or along those lines, and I think that's very important. Those are very important moves. And you know, it doesn't have to start with the government. It really can and should start with people. With I mean, your expression of acknowledgement of the process of colonization is the kind of thing that I think that would be healthy for people to do more often. I mean, I don't think people need to grovel and say, you know, I'm sorry for my ancestors did. I think I take that in the spirit that it's offered. But that's, you know, a lot of people aren't going to be inclined to do that. But it's some acknowledgement that this is what's happened, and that there needs it's not simply a matter of the past. It's something that lives today. These issues that live today and that need to be addressed, and that the society overall needs to take some responsibility for addressing. And so moves at the societal level, as opposed to simply what the government might do, are very important. There's a question over here. Ma'am. She was first. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to, no, go ahead. You had your hand up first. Okay.
I just wanted to follow up and ask what you thought about Ecuador and what it is doing with its First Peoples and tribes.
Okay, the question is about Ecuador. Yeah, my beat, as it were, is the whole world, so I have to have some familiarity with these issues. In fact, I was involved in the constitutional reform process at the very beginning of my mandate as UN Special Rapporteur in 2008. And indigenous peoples, through their major organizations, participated very actively in the Constitutional Convention that was convened in order to come up with a new constitution in 2008 that was adopted. And they were able to have included in the Constitution very robust recognition of their rights as indigenous peoples, as indigenous nations, and to have included in the Constitution a recognition of the plurinational character of the state and recognition of their place in the country, and recognition of the country as really a country made up of different identities and nations. Now, it's one thing to have, a nice, pretty constitution, another thing to see those nice constitutional norms or provisions implemented, but it's an important step. And so now the debate, the discussions about particular issues, including issues of extractive industries, oil and gas exploration in indigenous territories, revolves around whether or not these rights are being respected, as opposed to 10, 20 years ago when there wasn't that basis for a principled discussion, and where the government simply was able to say, well, hey, you have no rights, we're sovereign and we're going to do what we want. And so these are important steps, and Ecuador has been at the forefront in terms of constitutional recognition of indigenous people's rights, although if we had more time, we could talk about all the shortcomings.
And nature, I mean, with recognition of the rights of the land.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. There's constitutional recognition of rights over lands, and then related legislation to do that. So there's important steps, but there are a lot of difficulties. I mean, I wouldn't want to put Ecuador up on a pedestal and saying it's a model in its actual behavior. But there are some very important steps. Oh, back here, yes.
So, I'm Alice Nash, and I teach Indigenous studies in the history department. And your remarks made me really think about how, what's the impact of sort of politically correct multicultural language in which we've all been, my students have all been told to say Native American, but they're still talking about Indians in the old colonial sense, and yet does this contribute to the invisibility of Indigenous peoples and their issues when we sort of think that we're not saying Indian, we're saying Native American, so that's enough. How much do the good intentions of, multicultural, liberal sort of conversation contribute to the feeling that we've done enough and there's an invisibility of current issues, or is that something that you think might be relevant?
So to what extent, the question is, to what extent does discussion about arriving at the politically correct terminology or characterizations impede actually going to the core issues? And that's a good point. I think it does to some extent. I think, I'm not saying the discussion is unimportant about whether or not indigenous peoples in the country are called Native, Indian, whatever. I honestly don't have a strong view on that, because in my world, Indian is used very by Indian people very normally. But I know some people do have a strong view of that, and I respect the discussion that goes around that, and I think it is an important one. But it does, especially in academic circles, obscure or at least impede a focus on the real issues. If we could just sort of get past the rhetoric and say, okay, what are the real concerns here? I had a law professor who used to say when people get caught up in terminology, he said, well, let's call it a banana, and then just talk about the banana. I don't want to, no one quote me saying I'm saying call Native peoples banana. But you get my point. Sometimes language limits us, limits our ability to conceptualize sometimes even what the issues are and to address them. But I'm often reminded when I deal directly with Native peoples and I'm there, and I find that things are, I'm dealing in other languages. I'm being interpreted into another language, and I'm often reminded how sometimes the debate over the language what the nature of that debate is can't even be conveyed, And so, there was this big concern about whether or not indigenous peoples are called populations or peoples. Now, there's some significance there. There is. I don't want to say there isn't. But as a lawyer involved in that debate and pushing for international recognition of Indigenous peoples as peoples, when I would consult with Indigenous leaders in this country in their own languages and in other places in their own languages, we would spend an hour or two simply trying to figure out how to convey the nature of the debate, the terminology peoples versus populations. You know, and every now and then I get an elder stand up and says, "This is worthless. You know, I don't care. Call it what you want. You know, this is what we want. We want our land back. We want our recognition. We want our sovereignty. We want our self-determination." You figure out the words. You're the lawyers or whatever. Okay, fine. You know, so yeah, you know, if we can get past the rhetorical loggerheads to those issues, that's what we need to be doing. And in universities and at the UN, we tend to be drawn to those rhetorical loggerheads and those rhetorical conundrums. And you know, there's a good reason for it. In the universities, we study rhetoric. We understand, you know, its meaning, the way constructs, you know, define our understanding of things, the way we look at it and approach things. These are important, but we need to keep it in perspective. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm Hannah, I'm also a student here. You mentioned the manifest destiny, and I was curious as to your thoughts. Do you think the wide acceptance of the manifest destiny led to the invisibility of the Native peoples versus like the contestment, even at the beginning of our government, of the American government, over, say, slavery? And I mean, manifest destiny was widely accepted as a policy, and do you think that led to the invisibility of the Native people here?
Yes, it did. It does in the following way, I think. It's a dogma. It represents a belief system that the country was destined to be conquered by the colonizers, and it was divine will for this to happen. And so the natural result of that dogma, the outcome of it, is for the people who were there first, the savages who populated, to disappear. And that was part of that whole, the whole thinking around manifest destiny. And like any dogma, you reject anything that's not consistent with it. So to the extent it's inconsistent with that dogma for Native peoples to continue to have a robust presence, you don't want to know about it. And that's what happens. You know, we see it in the schools. We see it in the schools, maybe not as in such raw terms as I just expressed it, but we see it there. You know, this is a great country. You know, it was blessed. God shed His grace on the country. You know, made it a productive country, took over the land and stuff. And yeah, there were these people here before, but you know, now they're okay, or they're gone, or they're just sort of melted into everybody else. That's the standard narrative that we have, and it's simply not convenient. It's simply not convenient to confront the reality that exists, the reality of Native peoples. And so, yes, it does contribute to that. Now, slavery was an uncomfortable institution from the beginning. There never really was a dogma that took hold in this country to embrace it. The slave owners, at least the elites, the founders who were slave owners, were apologetic about it. It was never like, okay, this is a God-given right to have slaves. They never accepted that thesis wholeheartedly. Now, maybe their ancestors had, but they had, you know, their intellect led them to see the incompatibilities between their expositions of liberty and equality with the institution of slavery. And so it was a matter of time before that went away. But there was no dogma that supported it in the same way, in sort of the foundations of the country's identity and personality, like there is with regard to manifest destiny. That is still embedded in the foundations of the country's identity and personality. And so it's a very difficult thing to address, I think. But it has to be addressed. Anything? Yeah.
My name's Emily. I don't have a specific question, but I was wondering if you could talk about Bolivia at all and kind of bouncing off what you said.
You don't have a specific question, I believe. I, you know, I'm under some constraints to talk just freely about any country because these are countries I'm engaging with in various cases and matters that some of are sensitive. Let me just say that Bolivia is a very interesting situation. You have an indigenous president, but fractured, a fractured indigenous movement, or various indigenous movements, one might say, such that there is now significant opposition among indigenous peoples themselves to him, among one segment. And you know, then there's the issue of control over natural resources, and that complicates things because Bolivia has maintained natural resource development as an element of the development of the country overall. Some would argue in much the same way previous governments have. So you find a lot of very interesting, let's say, put it that way, issues there. But I'll be going there probably in the next few weeks or months to look at some of these issues, and when I come back, I'll be able to speak more freely once I've made public what I say.
Do you have any resources to recommend if someone wanted to know more specifically about Bolivia?
Ask one of your teachers here. I mean, yeah. No. Anyway, yeah. I mean, I could. What am I list of bibliography? Look at the footnotes in one of my books. I think you'll find some stuff. Okay. I mean, I hate to be sort of pure evasive, but there are a lot of resources actually. Okay. Sorry, was there something while we're here? Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to. Yes, you, Nicole.
Yes, hi.
I know her name. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've seen a shift by the United States given their support of the UN Declaration in 2010. I know the Senate held a hearing on the UN Declaration and its applicability here in the United States that you presented at your visit in May, and also your recent release of your report on your visit last week. If you've seen a shift here in the United States to kind of start looking at the situation here in the United States, its laws, its policies, in relation to international human rights law, these recent pieces. Has there been any shift?
Not on a macro level. You can't say the government has shifted. What you can say is that there are actors within the government that are starting to pay attention. You know, people within the Forest Service. You know, I've been contacted, well, how would you look at this in light of the Declaration in revising their consultation policies, for example? I'm going to an event at the Department of Justice. I've been invited to go there to present on the implications of the Declaration for initiatives to strengthen indigenous customary law in the administration of justice. So you see things like that. You know, there's now the Office of the Advisor to the President on indigenous issues. And that office has been increasingly sensitive, in my view, to the international standards and the Declaration in particular. You see much more engagement than there was before on the part of the administration on indigenous issues at the international level. There was this hearing that the Senate had, but none of the senators were there. It was Senator Inouye, but he was there. Al Franken showed up for a few minutes, told a couple of jokes, and walked out. That was thrilling for me. I love that guy. Yeah, so you have some symbolism like that. But in my report, I say there really needs to be a reflection upon it. And I speak to all three branches of government. I talk about the Congress needing to reflect upon what kind of reforms need to be made and to have present in all its legislative deliberations these international standards of human rights. I really don't care if they call them international standards or they pay attention to the Declaration itself, as long as the concepts that are embodied in there, sort of a fresh look at Indigenous issues, which are from a human rights perspective, what is right, what is correct, is incorporated. And I point to the international standards and the Declaration because it represents a consensus at the global level that the U.S. and others have have subscribed to, at least in principle. I also spoke to the executive branch and saying there needs to be a high level sort of education about the Declaration through system wide throughout the vast bureaucracy. During my mission, I found that people, and I visited many federal agencies and departments, and I found that there was vague awareness, but not really about its content, with few exceptions. There are several exceptions, but for the most part, there was still only vague awareness about these concepts. But there was an interest, certainly. Then in my report, I also speak to the federal judiciary. I address these archaic legal doctrines that have persisted within the jurisprudence of the federal courts that continue to define, in many fundamental ways, Indigenous federal or state relations. And these include doctrines such as the doctrine of discovery, conquest, that have the effect of proclaiming the power of Congress to unilaterally extinguish Indigenous rights. These doctrines of colonial origins live today. This is the only country where you have these colonial era doctrines living in the jurisprudence of a modern judicial system. I don't know any other place that has these doctrines overtly invoked. And so I've said, look, and it's interesting because these doctrines come from the international law of the 19th century, the 18th, 19th century. The international law of that time. You can look at the international law text of that time. Well, they called it the Law of Nations, but basically it was the international. And this is where you'll find these doctrines. And Chief Justice John Marshall, he consciously invoked the Law of Nations. And you see those words in those opinions. Consciously invoked the Law of Nations regarding Native peoples to come up with these doctrines. Yet the courts continue to embrace the Law of Nations of then while being blind to the Law of Nations of today. And so I've argued, well, why, that was the Law of Nations then. You guys got to modernize and look at the Law of Nations today to infuse jurisprudence, diffuse modern doctrine with the Law of Nations or international law of today. And I think that can happen. I think it requires effort by not just the courts, the judges on the courts, but by litigants, those who practice before the courts, those who teach about Indian law need to do it. 20 years ago, when did I start teaching? God, time flies. I started in 1988, and I was researching these issues. And I among my federal Indian law friends, the people who did domestic law, I was almost uniformly told, well, the courts will never accept that. So you can't talk about it, we're not going to teach it. And my argument, well, if you say that to the students, of course, they're not going to, they're going to think it's worthless. They're never going to include it, and they're going to be judges, and they'll think it's worthless. Yeah, of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what I discovered was that a lot of these folks who are teaching Indian law just were uncomfortable with it. And just like we all are, we're experts in the field, and so if something we don't know, it can't be really relevant, right? If you don't know it and you're an expert, well, by definition, it can't be important. And I figured that out, and I said, well, it's just a matter of time. Okay, we'll wait a while and see what happens. And that's happening, And now you see an awakening among our senior colleagues in the federal Indian law world who are saying, this stuff might have some relevance. So anyway, and now, here, I'm a UN special rapporteur putting in a UN document. It's in a UN document there, and now it's, before the world to see, for whatever that's worth. So anyway, another question? How much time do we? What?
We can take some more questions.
Sure. I'm. Yeah. No. I'm. Yeah, no, it's up. I just, okay, I just don't want to abuse my podium privilege here, you know? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wonder, it seems that you're a young man, and I just wonder when you started with the cause, and I just, related to that, I just wonder what young Native people articulate that they want. What do they want in their future? And I think that was you, maybe. And time flies by, as we say. We started in '88. Whoop, now we're out here now. And so I just wonder, I think that young people really have an important voice, and they can make a change, I
Hmm.
believe, and a difference. And I just wonder, I don't hear the Native young people voice, and I just wonder if you could share any of that with us.
I like your definition of youth. It's sort of what I tell my kids. However old I am, that's young, you know? So, the question is, what do the Native kids,
Young
uh,
people, like the young people here,
what are they?
and younger, I mean, what do they want? What's their vision?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, really, it's up to them to speak for themselves, and they can, and they do. But, you know, Native people, like people generally, are diverse, and you'll hear different expressions. But, you know, there are common themes that one hears, and it's wanting to be, on the one hand, wanting what every human being wants. You know, happiness, love, affection, security, possibilities, opportunities, but within a context of having those relations maintained, those relations that go back in time, that go to place, that go to the people around you. And so it's not the caricature that one might think, you know, going back to the past and living some romantic way. Or it's really not that. And often that's what people think about when you talk about native rights. Oh, we can't go back. No, that's not what I hear, and I don't think that's what you see. Native youth want what people want generally. I mean, you can't. I mean, rock music, what native rock music, and opportunity, but opportunities that would include a good job in their home area, as opposed to having to move away. Technology, the use of technology, but the use of technology to produce art forms that are reflective of their own cultures, these kinds of things. It's not anything really different than people across the world want.
I wonder, are there any grassroots where those voices could come together so that there's cross-cultural interaction?
Yeah, there are a number of youth movements that we see around the world, both within the U.S. and across the globe. Yeah. Anything else? More? Yes.
Cindy Plummer again.
Okay. Yeah.
But you might be just interested to note that there was when I was in seminary some years back, there was a young Native student who kind of set the whole theological world on its heels because he challenged the notion that of the promised land, of Moses leading
Mm-hmm.
the Jewish people into land really that belonged to somebody else. There were other people living there. So he raised the notion of indigenous people challenging manifest destiny, as she said, in the Old Testament.
Well, I'm not going to touch the Palestinian issue. Yeah.
Can I ask maybe one final question?
Okay.
I'm wondering, I know that you don't necessarily want to hold up models for us to look at, this nation has done it right or anything like that, but I'm wondering if you could say whether you would, looking kind of collectively at what's gone on with truth and reconciliation around the world, whether this is something that you would advise the U.S. government to pursue, or, would you think perhaps that, looking, for example, at the case of Australia, that was particularly successful because of the groundswell of popular encouragement and support before the government took those actions. Would you not suggest that the government be the leader in saying, pursuing, actively pursuing such a process? Would you think that we need to have the social movement first? Or just speak to, should we have this in the U.S. and, if so, should we look to the government to do it?
Now we're getting to the old, what's better, the government or the private sector, huh? That kind of stuff. Sort of. No, I that's a good question. Should the government take the lead in the reconciliation effort? I have recommended that it maybe not take the lead, but it take decided action. I don't think it necessarily has to be the lead, but the government has an important role to play because of the power it wields and the responsibility it has with regard to these issues. It has direct responsibility over the concerns that I've raised, that Native people across the country have raised, and it has power to address those. The truth is, Congress could restore lands around the country and restore sacred places to Indigenous control very easily. I don't mean easily politically. Yeah, that would take political will but these things happen, If when there's a big donation, or well, I don't want to start impugning anybody, but if when for some reason or another, some powerful congressperson wants something to happen, they move forward. This could happen. I mean, the restoration of native control over lands that are under federal administration doesn't really upend any individual's particular interests, for the most part, and can be done. So the government does have an important role to play. So I have recommended, and I did so in my report, that it take specific initiatives. But at the same time, I acknowledge and I advocate for a broader national conversation that involves education among society generally. And certainly leaders, civic leaders, church leaders, educators have a very important role to play, and initiatives they can take without waiting for any government action, and that has to happen at some point. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. And